up. So we're going to talk about the life cycle of a pharmaceutical product. I recognize that there's probably people in the audience that are more interested in medical devices or diagnostic testing. I might do a bit of a poll in a minute. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind switching, let's tell you about who you're listening to. So my name is Jeff Smith. I head up the pharmaceutical division within Calian. My background, I've been in the pharmaceutical business for over 30 years. I started off working with the Division of Allergy and Clinical Immunology at the Kingston General Hospital, working with Dr. James Day, running clinical trials in asthma and allergy studies. We invented what's known as the Environmental Exposure Unit. It's a unique way of running clinical trials where we had about 200 people sitting in a room, and we had a pollen dispenser that dispensed pollen into this room, fans that circulated the pollen. People would get allergic, symptomatic to the pollen, and then we would give them medication, and we would evaluate or assess their symptoms over a period of time, and then see which product was more effective than another, which was more effective than placebo. It was an interesting business. Was doing that for about 5 or 6 years. Then I started working for Schering-Plough, which is now Merck, and I continued to work in the clinical research division with them. And then in 2001, about 22 years ago, I started a company called All Phase Clinical Research, which is a CRO, a contract research organization. We're going to talk more about that today. And in 2012, I started another company called Alio Health Services, which is a PSP company. We're going to tell you more about that later. In 2020, I sold those companies to Calian, hence my logo on the screen. Calian is a Canadian company, about 40 years old. They are publicly traded, about $62 a share, $720 million in market cap. They operate in 4 distinct divisions: advanced technologies, IT and cyber, learning, and health. We, of course, fit in health, and there's 5 divisions within health. Of course, the most important one is the pharma division, because I head that one up. I've been working with them now for over 3 years. And with me is Caitlin Sadler. She also works for Calian. She's the VP of PSP. I'm going to hand the mic to Caitlin to introduce herself.
Thanks, Jeff, and it's great to be here today. My name is Caitlin Sadler, and I'm the vice president of the company that Jeff mentioned called Alio Health Services. We were acquired by Calian, of course, in January of 2020. So now I'm the vice president of patient support programs with Calian. And what that means is I lead up all things relating to patient services. So whether that is, for example, a nursing service that enables a patient access to a product, which could be a medication or a device or a diagnostic. It might also be reimbursement support services, so that's the financial assistance component to helping a patient access different therapies and different medications. So that's what I do with Patient Solutions, and I will pass it over to Stefan.
Thank you both. So I'm covering, let's say, the third bit of the whole kind of, let's say, pathway to the market, which is market access and reimbursement. I'm Stefan Walzer, coming from Germany. I worked in the past in different consultancies, more on a global level, was then moving over into the industry, where I was working for one of the big pharmaceutical companies for a couple of years. And roughly 11 years ago, I founded Mars, a healthcare consultancy company focusing on market access and reimbursement in the German-speaking markets. But I've also founded another company similar to Jeff, just in the other area, which is called PNN, Pricing and Negotiations, which is more focused on, let's say, bringing innovations as well from the US and Canada into Europe, but also they are focusing obviously on market access and health economics. So I think we can directly jump into the topic. So I hand over again to you, Jeff.
Arguably, pharmaceutical development is probably the hardest one of the 3. Takes the most time and costs the most money, and also has the biggest potential upside as well. The purpose of the workshop, we're going to go over the pharmaceutical development life cycle, so you get a sense of what you're getting involved in for those people that are interested in pharmaceutical development, but it's similar, as I said, for the other ones. We're going to talk about contract research organizations. I guess you could say those partners in your development process are the ones that do the heavy lifting to get the data that you need to be able to market the product and make some money. We're going to talk about market access services, and we're going to talk about patient support programs, which are somewhat similar. Next slide. When we look at the three different subjects that we're going to cover today, we've got on the, I guess it would be your left, this is my left too, the research and development, or the discovery and research phase of it. So that brings a pharmaceutical product from the bench, we say the bench, which is where you're developing a molecule that we think has promise for therapeutic purpose. Eventually that gets you into preclinical work, which is effectively animal testing, and then we get into human clinical testing, and then eventually we get that to the market. In the process of developing the product, we're working with people like Stefan and Caitlin to develop a strategy to get that product onto the market and commercialized as fast as possible, because you have a limited amount of time to get the best value out of this product that you're bringing to market. So if we go to the next slide. This slide, or that graphic, I really like that graphic. It tells a lot of the story. So on the far right, or left side of the graphic, that represents the discovery process. Like I mentioned earlier, we often refer to them as molecules. These molecules are developed that we think, okay, this molecule will have a therapeutic benefit in, say, allergic rhinitis or hay fever. A lot of those will drop out through the process of before you get them into preclinical, and then we start testing these molecules in preclinical. So that's animal testing, and the purpose of that is to see whether there is a dosage amount of this particular molecule that could be safely tested in humans. We don't get any efficacy information from that, but we do get some animal-related pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic information. And then if it looks like it could be a safe product, then we will take it into phase 1 testing. And it depends on the product that you're bringing. An oncology product will be actually tested within patients that have cancer. If we're talking about allergic rhinitis, then it'll be tested in healthy human volunteers. So a relatively small group of people, 25 to 50, 75, maybe 100 people. And you're effectively doing the same thing in a human model as you were doing in the animal model. We just want to find out what's happening with this molecule when it's inside a human being, the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of the product. And then we would take it into phase 2 testing, and as you can see, this darker blue funnel is getting thinner as we go along. We take it into phase 2 testing. Oftentimes that's called dose finding. So we're actually going to be testing the molecule in patients that have the disease in question, but we don't know what's the therapeutic dose. We'll test various dosage levels of it, and maybe we'll find that we'll test placebo, which is a non-active product, against 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, and 20 milligrams. And the evaluation may show that 5 milligrams is not very effective, but it's very safe, so it's useless. 20 milligrams is really effective, but it's got a lot of side effects, and it has more side effects over products that are already on the market, so that's not going to work. But maybe we find that 10 milligrams is reasonably effective and it's safe, and so we'll take that dose into phase 3 testing. And that could involve a lot of people, depending on the indication we're evaluating the product for. And that's where you're testing your product against other products that are on the market. So there's no point in bringing a product to market that isn't at least as good as the worst product that's on the market, because nobody will buy it. And then after that, so after that clinical development process, we submit a dossier to the regulatory authority, the Health Canada, the FDA, the EMA, and within a period of months, hopefully we get approval, and then we can start to market that drug. So sometime in around, what do you think, Stefan, phase 2, phase 3, we start interacting with your group to come up with a strategy to be able to get access to the market as fast as possible. And the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Some of the sub-bullets here, we reiterate these on several slides, but the process of getting a product from phase 1 through to market takes 8 to 10 years. It depends on the type of product, which is a long time. And they say the average cost is about $1.3 billion, so extremely expensive to bring these products to the market. And there's about a 10 to 30% chance that you're actually going to get this product to market for a number of different reasons, which we'll cover off. If we go to the next slide. also a graphic. Just trying to think if there's something on that last slide I wanted to cover. I think I can cover it here. This is also an interesting graphic, which is kind of representative of any type of product. If I was going to develop this microphone, there would be a research and development time and cost to that, and then I would eventually get it onto the market, and I would make money over a period of time. I would have patented the design of this, and eventually my patent would run out and people would be able to compete with me. Similar to in the pharmaceutical industry, you've got 20 years. So you want to register that patent at an opportune time, not too soon, not too late, and then you are against the clock. And as I said, it takes, let's say it takes 10 years to develop a product. You've now got 10 years to recover the cost, this $1.3 billion, and make some money on top of that. And it isn't a linear process, as the diagram represents. You're going to start making money out of the gate, but you're probably going to actually be making very little money, or actually very little profit, because you're going to be giving away the product for free for a while until you can get somebody to pay for it, which would be benefits providers or the government. And then you have kind of a glow period at the top where you're making lots of money. You've got your sales team selling the product. You've got payers who've picked it up. But you're also cognizant of the fact that you're going to run out of patent, and the competitors, they're already eyeing your product. They're testing your patent. There may be lawsuits going on, and then eventually you come off patent, which is called loss of exclusivity, and then you're now competing. And there's different mechanisms that you can still remain relevant as the innovator of the product. You can create your own generic version of it. So to speak to the cost again, I broke it down into the different phases. So phase one, I can't read it, but I think that says $25 million. Phase two is around $60 million, and phase three, hundreds of millions of dollars to bring this product to market. Ultimately, adding all of that up, $1.3 billion. That math doesn't add up, but these are examples. Every product's different. So generally speaking, or maybe this is across the board, I don't think there's anybody that can innovate a product and bring it to the end of its patent life cycle on their own. It's just too expensive in the pharmaceutical business. So at some point, you're going to have to partner with a large pharma company to get this product on the market and commercialized appropriately. So when is that time? When is the right time for that? Well, I don't think, generally speaking, a pharma company is interested in buying your product if it's in the preclinical stage. You haven't proven anything other than suitable toxicity to take it into human testing. In phase one, now you've proven that the product is safe at certain dosages, but you still don't know if it's effective. At phase two, at some point in the phase one period, you're probably socializing this product with pharma companies. You're trying to get some partnerships, some awareness of the product. At phase two, you're starting to demonstrate that this product is effective and it's safe. And if it has the potential to be a blockbuster drug, you're going to create a lot of frenzy in the pharma division, businesses, that they want to buy that product from you. So that is probably the sweet spot. But at this point, you've spent $60 to $100 million. So you having to fund it up to that point is a problem. But that's probably the way you would want to approach moving this finally into commercialization. All right, next slide. Again, another interesting graphic, and we reiterate several points. The 20-year patent life is an important one. In the graphic with the dark blue and the light blue, I'm not sure how well you can read it, but the top bar is a product called Humira, which is made by AbbVie. And the lifetime value of that drug is around $252 billion. That's a significant amount of revenue to generate over the 10 years that they were able to actually monetize it. So when you think about a $1.3 billion development cost to make $252 billion, that seems like a pretty decent return on investment. Now, keeping in mind that is an exception. But the point I would want to make about that slide is that time is of the essence. If you've got a 20-year patent life, you want to monetize it over as many years as possible. 10 is fine, 11 is better. If you look at Humira, if you got that one extra year, that's another $25 billion. I'd like that. If you can get 2 more years, even better. So when developing these products, it's important to partner with the right partners to take you where you need to go. So market access teams that actually have experience with your product type. They've got experience about how to get these products onto the market quickly, how to get physician recognition, how to get them on formularies, how to get benefits providers to pay for the drug. Before that, CROs that you partner with, wanting to make sure that they can implement the project effectively and efficiently, because that's one of the, actually, I'll speak to this in another slide so I don't get ahead of myself. That talks about loss of exclusivity. Once a product's patent expires, within 3 years you lose 90% of the value of that drug for your company. So the competition is fierce as soon as the product comes off patent. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the process of bringing a product to market. Similarities to medical devices and diagnostics, but not the same. You need to get, in the pharmaceutical world, you need to get the health authorities involved in the process. So it all starts in the US with an IND, in Canada with a clinical trial application. This is an application that you submit to the regulatory authority to say, this is the product, here's the history we have on the product, preclinical work that we've done. Here's the protocol that we've developed to do the first clinical testing. Here are the physicians that are going to be part of that project. Can you give us approval to move that into the testing phase? And then you get that approval usually within 30 days. And then that arrow, the first down arrow at the top, that actually represents about 8 to 10 years of time. But ultimately, through the process of doing all of these clinical trials, like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, multiple trials within each one of those phases, you're always working with the regulatory authorities to get their input on clinical trial design, strategies. The regulatory authorities, they are interested in seeing these products come to market, and they are your friends in the process, so you should lean on them as much as possible. Failing to do that and going a bit rogue and doing your own thing is going to end up being a problem most likely in the future unless you're smarter than they are. And then ultimately you submit a new drug submission in Canada or a new drug application in the US. There's a period of time, 5 to 9 months, where the regulatory authority is reviewing your dossier. They're already very familiar with your product at this point, but they're going to go out and they may do audits of some of the studies that you've done. And just being certain that the data that you've presented to them by spot testing what you've done is actually sound. And then the successful outcome of that is, in Canada, notice of compliance or a drug information number. All right. So I talked about the timeline being 8 to 10 years, and it varies quite a bit depending on the product. But there are faster ways to get to market, and these are 4 of them. We're not going to spend any time talking about them, but just so you're aware, depending on what kind of a product you have, you may be able to get approval to move the product through the process faster. Next slide. The next 2 slides speak to the journey. So on the right side of this, on the left side of this slide, we talk about the development journey, which involves a CRO. So that's the process of running clinical trials, collecting the data, analyzing the data. In the middle part there, we're working with market access. In the part to the right, we're working with the mechanics of getting the drug out into the commercialized network. So manufacturing, distribution, promotion, et cetera. Next slide. And this is from the patient's perspective. On the left side of the screen, we're talking about clinical trials, recruiting patients for trials, analyzing their data, eventually using that data to get approval for your product. And on the right side, we're talking about getting that product into patients. So this is speaking to the patient support program part of the journey, where, and Caitlin will speak to this in more detail, but some specialty pharmaceuticals are very expensive drugs. They're difficult to administer. They are injectables or infusion products, so we do need to get a mechanism of getting that product into the patient. We at Calian use our nursing network. We have a nursing network across Canada of about 2,800 nurses. We have nurses in the US and in Europe, and we have a specialized software that we use to Uberize the nursing network and make the whole process super efficient. So let's talk about contract research organizations. So these are your development partners through the process. So this is the first bit of the process where you're trying to get your product approved, and this represents the 8 to 10 year timeline. There are different types of CROs. The type of CRO that we are is a professional services CRO. We manage everything from soup to nuts when it comes to development of the protocol, running of the clinical trial, contracting with the investigative centers, which are the physicians that they recruit the patients. We clean the data, we analyze the data, we manage the data, and then ultimately we write up a clinical study report, and then that's part of the dossier going forward. There are CROs that are preclinical CROs. There are CROs that specialize in regulatory affairs. Oftentimes you will partner with a particular CRO that will be the general contractor of the other CROs to help along the process if you've got a particularly small company. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And then the importance of clinical research. So why do we have to do clinical research? Well, we have to do it so that we can prove that the product that we want to bring to market is safe and effective. It is a legal requirement. You can't bring a pharmaceutical product or some medical devices to market without having done your clinical research. The importance of clinical research, it's not just about the fact that you have to have clinical research, it's about managing the clinical research in an appropriate way. So there are regulations around clinical trials, known as the International Conference on Harmonization. So all CROs know about these regulations, and they can stay, and they're not regulations, they're guidelines. Well, I guess they're regulations, but they're guidance documents that tell you how to run a clinical trial. They don't demand you do it in a certain way because every product is a bit different. But all CROs will follow the ICH guidelines so that the data that they're collecting can be used in countries that follow those guidelines. So Europe follows them, US follows them, Canada, Japan. If we run a trial in the US, that data should be usable in the European Union, provided that we follow these guidelines. And then it's also about managing the data. So you need to have you have to have a data management solution that is 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. You need to have a mechanism of making sure that the data that's getting entered at the investigative centers and gets put into usually an electronic data capture solution is accurate. So we send out teams of monitors to go out to these investigative sites to check the data against the patient chart to see if there's any fraud or just errors. We clean at that level. The data management team will clean at a different level, looking at all of the data across all of the patients, looking for unusual trends or particularly unusual trends within an investigative site, brings that to the attention of the monitor who goes out and has a look and sees what's going on. There have been many cases, not many cases, but there have been cases of fraud at the investigative site. That's part of our job to uncover that. But ultimately, you want a clean data set that you can evaluate and that you can present to a regulatory authority to say, this is why we're making the decision to market this product. If the product's effective, it's safe, here's the data to support it. So data is super important. If we go to the next slide. These are the different things that a CRO will do. And I would say that the root of all of it is data. So when we run a clinical trial, we are looking for physiologically homogeneous patients. So what does that mean? It means that we are excluding certain types of patients because we're worried that their data will befuddle the data set. So for example, we won't include patients with certain comorbidities or certain concomitant medications that are known to or potentially known to interact with the investigational product. So we will work with certain types of patients that give us data that we want, and we will analyze that data and we will evaluate that data, and that data will be used to get the product onto the market. But once that product's on the market, the physicians may prescribe it off-label, so that we will tell them in a product monograph, this is the way that we suggest you prescribe the product. But they have the ultimate decision-making power of how they want to prescribe it. And they will eventually prescribe the product to patients that would not have been included in clinical trials. So it's incumbent on the manufacturer to continue to surveil the product once it's on the market. So we call that post-market surveillance. We also call that RWE, or real-world evidence. And there is an ongoing process once you get the product to market to continue to make sure that it is safe and effective. Next slide. So common barriers to drug development. So there's all sorts of things that can go wrong in the process. You could run out of money. You could end up working with a development partner that isn't very good at what they do. You could design poor protocols. You can recover from some of this. You can run a clinical trial and then realize that the results of it didn't address the hypothesis you had because you were looking at the wrong type of patient. You could redo the trial. Spend another $3 or $4 or $5 million doing that, but of course it's coming out of this budget of funds that you have encouraged your investors to give you, and at some point, if you make too many mistakes, you run out of time and you just run out of confidence of your investors. So there's lots of things that can happen along the process. But I think a lot of what I'm saying is it's expensive. You've got a certain amount of time. It sounds like I'm discouraging you from the process. I don't intend that. On the plus side, there's a big payoff at the end if you do it right, and also the process is well documented. Pretty much any product you're going to want to bring to market, a similar product has already been brought to market. You can follow that trail. You can improve upon it. There are mechanisms now, such as systematic reviews, that can help you analyze data that you probably wouldn't come across on your own if you didn't use some of these softwares to find it. And that data can inform your development strategy. If somebody's already done the work and that work is done according to ICH guidelines, you don't have to redo it. That could be part of your dossier. You just save yourself a year. So it is complicated, it is expensive, but it is there's a lot of experience around it. Next slide. So I think I'm going to be passing this over to Caitlin shortly. The CRO and PSP hybrid. Calian is one of the only companies in the world that has both a CRO and a PSP company, and the only company in the world that has a software that can join those two worlds together. And that software is called Nexi. So I mentioned that once you have a product on the market, you have to do real-world evidence for various reasons. Some of it is post-market surveillance for safety. Some of it is to inform the marketing teams how this product is actually being prescribed in the real world. And some of it is actually, hopefully, revealing evidence that can create a new indication for your product. Viagra is an example of that. It was for hypertension, and now it's used, I think everybody knows what it's used for now. That was a big payoff for Pfizer, and that came out of data analysis, adverse events actually. So that was post-marketing revelation. So when we run a patient support program, I won't get too deep on it because I'm going to take all your thunder, with specialty pharmaceuticals, the physician will write a prescription for this product, which is expensive and difficult to administer. They will enroll the patient into a PSP. We will get the enrollment form, and then we will reach out to the patient to find reimbursement coverage for the product, and then we will assign a resource to get the product into the patient. That process and our software that manages all that is collecting data. Now, typically, what a pharma company will do is they will run a RWE study as another type of clinical trial and completely separated from the PSP, and they'll just treat the PSP data as operational data. So there's a huge loss of opportunity there. In our world, we can put those two together. We can design the PSP to collect data that's useful for RWE and drop the cost of an RWE study in half, and including the time to do the study.
So with that, I might actually just take a moment to pause and just engage the audience a little bit, kind of understand where you are at with your different products. So Peter's comment is really probably the target for this audience is around devices that are now marketed, looking to access into international markets. And you do kind of work with the blend of services across the CRO, the PSP, and market access to kind of get to that ultimate outcome, but it is a journey. So I'm going to talk about patient solutions, and before I jump right into patient solutions, I'm actually going to describe kind of where the terminology of patient support program comes from. It's really a pharmaceutical term. And not everybody's always familiar with patient support programs. So effectively what a patient support program is, it was really born out of pharmaceutical companies who had specialty products or specialty medications. And so we're quite fortunate in Canada, US, Europe as well, to have phenomenal healthcare systems And so oftentimes we think when a new product, a new medication comes to market, it will just be covered by the public healthcare system. It will just be accessible. That's not always the case. That is the case for, your over-the-counter medications. But when you're talking about specialty medications, the big therapeutic areas for that would be oncology, mental health, rheumatology, kind of all of those big therapeutic areas. A specialty medication comes onto market, and the public and the private insurers won't just pick up the cost of that medication. So there's a process of market access, which is where we work with Stefan's team to actually show the payers that there's a clinical utility of this new product that is now on the market. In addition to that, specialty medications and devices and diagnostics will fit into this space as well. It's not always easy for the patient themselves to access the medication. So beyond the financial component, most specialty medications are injectables or they're infusion programs, or they might be something like an oncology product or a chemotherapy that requires a blood monitoring to be done monthly just to stay on treatment. And things like injections, infusions, and blood draws are not services that, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that myself. So most patients aren't able to actually access the medication themselves. It's quite a bit different than an oral product. So if I can give a quick example of a local company that we've been working with, and I guess we started working with the local company Scientra just over a year ago. Scientra is a local to Calgary company who's developed a blood test for the early detection of breast cancer. And in order for a patient to kind of access their test results, of course, they would need a blood collection, and most patients aren't comfortable doing their own blood collection. So Scientra was coming to us looking for a solution to that kind of blood collection conundrum. And so we've built a patient support program around that product. In that journey of creating the patient support program around the Scientra product, we've noticed that there's different access barriers for patients, such as the financial ones and even the distribution networks of how do we actually get the device or the product to the patient. So with that's kind of where a patient support program came from. So it's a pharmaceutical term, but there's ways that you apply the patient support program to devices and diagnostics as well. And so with that, I'm going to go to the next slide. And talk a little bit about the value add of a patient support program. So there's really three pieces of it. And oftentimes a life sciences company will think, okay, well, now that I've gotten my product on the market, now patients will purchase it. Now we'll be able to generate revenue. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There's kind of three barriers to overcome, and that's awareness, access, and then differentiation. You have to be able to compete with your competitors. A patient support program kind of supports all three. We really play in the access piece. So we kind of facilitate that access to a product, whether it's a device, a diagnostic, or a medication. And by making your product more accessible, it's now differentiated, and the physician community is now aware of that product, right? So maybe just jumping into that access piece a little bit, summarize the access challenges into three main barriers. And on the next slide, you're going to see the kind of full list of services that you would access through a PSP provider like Calian. But they really fit into kind of three buckets. And so thinking about your product, you got the bucket of financial assistance. How is the patient going to financially access this medication or this product? The second bucket is going to be, how is the patient going to access the therapy? So is it an injectable? Is it an infusion? Is there some kind of nursing services that's required beyond just the product itself? And the third, which is often not necessarily thought of as directly a PSP service, but it's your distribution channels. So with a specialty medication, that's pharmacy networks. So that's pharmacies who dispense the medication and dispense the product. For devices and diagnostics, it's the same conundrum, right? If you have a device, you still have to get that device to the patient. So what does your supply chain network look like? And that's where a PSP helps as well. So I'm sure if you think of your product and if you think of those kind of three buckets, you can kind of figure out which buckets are applicable to you. And then we kind of get to know those pain points associated to your products, what are the barriers, for the patient ultimately, and then we design a patient support program around that product. And to Jeff's earlier point, there's no one solution fits all. That's the case for the CRO, the PSP, and the market access teams as well. The one piece that I'll add before I kind of dive into what is a patient support program is just back to Jeff's point around data. Data is really important throughout that journey. And so you've kind of got your pre-market journey, which is mostly on the CRO side. And then you have your post-market journey, which we think of as your kind of patient support program side. And all along that journey, both pre and post-market, you're collecting a lot of data. So if you can have these common systems to collect data, then we can funnel that data over to the market access team, and then we leverage that data throughout the journey to show the clinical benefit and the clinical utility of these products. And it's that data that we're handing over to the market access team that ultimately results in that reimbursement funding, that coverage that you're ultimately looking for. Does that make sense? So jumping into what is a patient support program, again, it's all about awareness and accessibility. You hear those words a lot. These are the services offered by a patient support program. I will actually just kind of run through and touch on each of them. It's not always intuitive what they mean. The ones highlighted in green are the most common ones that we see, but it can be a lot more than that. So another good way to look at this list is these are the barriers for the patient. Right? This is what's preventing a patient from moving forward. And actually, before I run through them, I'll give you a quick example as well. For most of us, if we're developing, whether it's, again, a device, a diagnostic, or a medication, it's ultimately a prescriber at the end of the day who is effectively the ones who's your salesperson who's selling that product to the patient, right? And they're ultimately selecting what they believe is the best therapy that will get the patient the best outcome for their unique diagnosis. And so if you have a patient walks into their doctor's office, let's say maybe it's a patient who's showing different symptoms of which therapeutic area will I pick today? Let's say they're showing symptoms and they're in the mental health space. And so the physician decides, well, I'm going to prescribe a product, and I know that I would like to prescribe either product A or B. And so I'll leave product names out of it for today. So I've got product A and product B. Let's say this is maybe it's a bipolar patient. Patients presented with symptoms, I now have a diagnosis, and the physician, I'm at a point where I'm going to select the medication. Let's say product A and B they're both specialty medications. Let's say they both cost $5,000 a month. They're both subcutaneous injections, okay? Product A has a patient support program around it. Product B does not. If I'm the physician, before my patient leaves, I need to know that my patient is going to stay on treatment. And the physician, I'm a really busy physician. I have a lot of patients that I'm taking care of. I want to know that when the patient leaves my physician's office or my office, that I'm going to get back the regular updates to know that my patient is still on treatment. And I want the confidence to know that when the patient walks out the door with this script, this prescription or a requisition, that they're going to go to the pharmacy and fill it, or that they're going to go to a local lab and complete the service that I've outlined in that requisition. So it's really important to me, the physician, to know that the patient starts treatment and adheres to treatment. That's really the two goals of the physician. So back to product A and B, if product A has a patient support program around it, and generally speaking, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you would have a sales team out there kind of generating awareness about your products and that there's a PSP available, so the physicians will know that this patient support program is available. The physician's obviously going to pick product A. The patient support program is going to enable financial access, and we'll get into how in a moment. The patient support program is going to send a nurse or a healthcare professional to the patient's home every month, every week, every 2 weeks, whatever the therapy dictates. And we're going to administer that subcutaneous injection on behalf of the patient every month. And then we're also going to work with the pharmacy that's assigned to that patient to make sure that the medication is dispensed before the patient's visit and that it's actually arrived to the patient's home or clinic before their injection. So the physician at this point, why wouldn't they select the product that's differentiated, right, is enabling access for the patient? And so that's really what a patient support program does. Yes, a patient support program comes at a cost. Sometimes, we're generally speaking working within the healthcare system, but without making that investment in your product, you might not be able to sell the product anyway. So a patient support program is really important to remove those barriers. So with that, what are the services in a patient support program? You can see them listed there. So patient enrollment and education. Once a physician has prescribed or requisitioned a product, oftentimes they don't have more than maybe 15 or 20 minutes with that patient, and the patient will have a lot of questions, particularly if we're talking about a mental health patient, an oncology patient. They want to ask questions about their diagnosis, and so at the point of enrollment into the PSP is our opportunity to, via a call center team, connect the patient with a nurse case manager. That's their dedicated single point of contact, and we can answer those questions. Financial assistance and reimbursement support we're going to touch on in 2 slides. Again, medication administration and nursing services. Medication adherence programs, disease management and coaching falls into education. That's more of the ongoing education piece. Patient monitoring and follow-up, clinical trial support. I put this one on here. It's a bit out of order. But your patient support services kind of span the entire journey. So even in the case of a clinical trial with our sister company, the CRO, if there's a clinical trial that's providing services to patients that require, for example, blood monitoring, even at that point before the product becomes a commercial product, we would provide those nursing services within the clinical trial. So it does kind of span the whole journey. Data collection and reporting we've touched on. Health outcomes tracking and reporting is kind of getting into the real world data. Call centers. On the point of call centers, those call centers are run on your behalf, and the point of the PSP is really to be an extension of your team. It's not to replace your team. It's, we present as if we are your product. So we're really kind of presenting as part of your culture, part of your team, part of your mandate with your patients. Patient advocacy and community building. Specialty pharmacy coordination goes along with distribution and logistics management. And so that's kind of that third pillar of the main access barriers for patients is how do you actually get your product physically to the patient in time for their treatment. And then, of course, electronic health record integration and support. So that's the technology piece. A lot of people don't know it, but every patient support program company effectively has to have an electronic health record system or an EHR. Many PSP companies will license an EHR, much like a physician's office. Some PSP companies, such as us, we have a proprietary electronic health record system, and we can introduce kind of new and novel and innovative solutions into our technology to make your CRO services, your PSP services, and your market access services more efficient. Because again, as Jeff mentioned, if we can just shave off a year or two of kind of getting your product to market, then ultimately you'll generate more revenue. This is the patient journey. Generally speaking, there is probably about 10 different patient journeys, depending on if we're talking, again, about a specialty medication, a device, diagnostic. Even if you look at certain patient support programs, just trying to think of a good example. So in cardiology, most cardiovascular medications are oral products. So there's really no medication administration or nursing services that are required. And so the purpose of a patient support program will be more around patient education and probably more importantly, reimbursement navigation. And so not every PSP is the same. They're kind of as unique as you and I or every person, and they're really designed to the needs of that product. Generally speaking, a full service patient support program for a pharmaceutical product would again touch on those three main barriers. So financial assistance, medication administration, and distribution. So the 3 challenges. What it typically looks like is you have a patient diagnosed. That's where the patient is with their physician. Patient is enrolled into a patient support program. Usually there's some form of an online interface for enrollment. Otherwise, most physicians still enjoy working by fax. That's okay too. So we support the patient enrollment piece. Once a patient is enrolled, we complete what's called a welcome call with that patient, usually about 30, 45 minutes, and we collect all of their kind of employment information. We complete financial means tests if that's a requirement, and we get to know who their payers and their insurers are. And then we actually, via the PSP, connect with those payers on their behalf. That can actually be really daunting for a patient when we're talking about specialty products. I think you'll see in a moment. On the next slide, it's not a simple process to get that product reimbursed. So we complete what's called a three-way call. We keep the patient on the phone with us, but we actually manage that conversation with the payers on their behalf. Once we've secured financial access to the medication, we send a request to the dispensing pharmacy. Dispensing pharmacy provides either in person at a retail pharmacy location, dispenses the product to the patient. If it's a specialty pharmacy, then we'll actually just ship the product to a clinic or a hospital location. Once the product has arrived for the patient's visit, then we administer the medication or provide other nursing services that are required around that product. Then that nurse who's part of the PSP, who's administering the medication, completes what's called, it's commonly known as a post-injection report, a post-infusion report, or if it's not a medication, then it's called an appointment report card. That appointment report card comes into our system, that's our electronic health record, but a copy is always sent to the physician. So again, that's a really important piece of any patient support program, is keeping the physician up to date, because ultimately they're the ones who has ordered the services on behalf of that patient. When I think of patient support programs and those three pillars of challenges, I think that the medication administration, nursing services, I think that's a common one that kind of everybody understands. Same with distribution. There's kind of logistics channels that we can work with. When we talk about reimbursement navigation, that one's actually really complex, and it varies based off of international geographies as well. And it's the services that a PSP offers within or that relate to reimbursement navigation that really tie closely into market access. And so that's where those two partners working together can be really quite important. So I'm going to go through kind of what are the different modalities of how a patient would financially access the medication. And you'll notice that there's an arrow that kind of goes left to right. What I was trying to represent here is if you have a new to market product that is not just going to go under kind of existing funding pathways, and you need to actually apply kind of for market access or reimbursement coverage via a reimbursement dossier, then typically on day one, the way that a patient would financially access that medication is through an out-of-pocket payment. That will immediately become your biggest barrier, right? It's trying to convince the patient or the physician that we should purchase this product versus one that's already on the market perhaps and has full coverage. So that's a really big barrier. So we want to avoid a patient payment as much as we can, and we, the patient support program, want to bridge the gap between market access, meaning your product is now commercial, and actually having reimbursement through, for example, a public payer. And so what happens in that gap? That gap can be, the length of that gap can be different depending on the country that we're talking about, as well as the product. I would say, just really roughly speaking, for specialty medications, in Canada, it can be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And so there's definitely a gap there. That's also part of that patent life for the specialty medication. So we don't want to have 5 to 10 years where we're not enrolling patients, we're not getting patients onto the treatment because they can't financially access it. So what are the different kind of mechanisms we can put in place in between? And that's what you see there in health spending accounts and financial assistance programs, particularly financial assistance programs. And then, of course, ultimately, you're looking to get coverage through private insurers and public insurers. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the solutions are to bridge that gap on the next slide. But just very briefly talking about international markets and landscapes for a moment. Of course, you can have a patient payment anywhere in the world, depending on the product. Health spending accounts, also known as healthcare spending accounts, or HSAs, HCSAs, those are predominantly available in Canada and the US. You don't see too many health spending accounts in Europe. I'll speak a little bit more about what a health spending account is on the next slide. Financial assistance programs, you can see those across Europe, US, as well as Canada. I would say you see them less often in Europe, just because in Europe it is a more publicly funded healthcare system. And they have, I would say they have very established kind of funding pathways that you can pursue. And we'll talk through those with Stefan in a moment. Public insurers, of course, are everywhere. Europe, US, Canada. Private insurers are, I'd say, more focused in Canada and the US. Europe tends to be more of a universal healthcare system, but there are private insurers as well. It's just in Canada and the US, we more commonly know of our private insurers as the insurance that we have access to through our employer, right? Whereas in Europe, it's a little bit different. It's just a more universally funded system. So I mentioned that there's different ways, different payment modalities that you can use to kind of bridge that gap between your products now available on the market and you've secured coverage through either a public or a private payer. And I've kind of listed them out here. So patient payment, I think that's an obvious one. Health spending accounts, we actually do get a lot of questions about health spending accounts. You would never use a health spending account for a medication, generally speaking. Health spending accounts can be really relevant to devices and diagnostics. A health spending account in Canada is regulated by the CRA, and it's an employer-offered benefit. It is not the same as your private insurance, and it's not the same as a well-being account or a wellness account. And I'll describe the difference in a moment. A health spending account, per the CRA, covers what's called medically related expenses. And you can go to the CRA website on health spending accounts, and it provides you with a really nice list of kind of what's covered and what's not. But it covers what's called medically related expenses. So if a physician writes a requisition or a physician writes a prescription, and the patient needs access to either a service or a product in order to stay on that treatment that the physician has requested, then they can cover the cost of that additional service or product through what's called a health spending account. A really good example is when my older daughter was, I think she was almost 1, she went through a very brief phase where she needed an asthma puffer. But a 1-year-old, it's really hard to get them to actually inhale the medication through this asthma puffer. So I had a prescription from her doctor, and my doctor suggested that I go purchase my own kind of face mask that you put on your daughter or your child, and you administer the medication, and then the next time your child breathes in, the medication just simply goes through the mask or is administered through the mask. That mask, to purchase it in Ontario, was $150, and it's out of pocket, but it was a medically related expense. It was an expense that was related to a prescription that her physician provided. And so you submit that through a health spending account. So similar to, and again, I'll use the local company that we're working with here today, similar to the Scientra product. So the Scientra product is requisitioned through a physician. It's a diagnostic or a device. So we have a requisition from a physician. The service, which is the blood collection, is actually reimbursed through a health spending account. So that's one way to bridge the gap between we have a product on market and we will eventually pursue public coverage. And it's actually, interestingly, a way to bridge that gap at no cost to the manufacturer. That's the key for health spending accounts. Financial assistance programs, this is what you would typically see in kind of a pharmaceutical specialty medication. You can do it with devices and diagnostics as well. Really important to note, though, that financial assistance programs do come at a cost to the manufacturer. I've listed out what the kind of the common financial assistance options are there. So you have copay programs. That's generally speaking where the PSP company becomes the adjudicator. So we have what's called a float account with the pharmaceutical company. We assign a copay number to the patient that covers either a portion or the full cost of a medication, and effectively the manufacturer is covering the portion of that cost. So it's a way to kind of subsidize a portion of the full cost of the medication. Compassionate coverage, very similar to a copay. Free goods is exactly what it sounds like. It means that you provide free product to either all or a subset of patients, and I'm going to get into the criteria in a moment. And then something called bridging. Bridging is when you provide copay or compassionate or free goods for a portion of time until the patient is eligible for coverage through a public or a private insurer. So generally speaking, those are your options for financial assistance. We like to pursue health spending accounts first, or private or public insurers, so that we don't have an out-of-pocket payment from the manufacturer, but financial assistance programs have benefits as well. And then, of course, payer coverage, and kind of that's what Stefan is going to speak to us about on the next slide or in a moment. Payer coverage is, of course, your ultimate outcome. It just takes some time. To get there. Lastly, all of the options that you see there, so health spending accounts, financial assistance, as well as payer coverage, they often come with eligibility criteria around them. So it's not as, it's not that the PSP company is coming and saying, I think you should provide a financial assistance program and just provide free product to everybody. That's not it. There will be a portion of patients that you want to facilitate access for. And I mean, even public and private payers do it as well. And that's where your kind of eligibility criteria come in. And that's also where kind of the PSP is designed specifically for your product. So I wouldn't say that there's kind of a one solution that fits everybody. But for example, things like financial means tests, that's a good way to decide who has access to kind of the subsidized financial assistance. More commonly, I'd say, with life sciences companies looking to run a PSP, it's more around eligibility criteria about the condition. And so we would put eligibility criteria to say we're going to offer a financial assistance program for patients who are, speaking to the Cyantra product again, I would say we would want to offer financial access to patients who are perhaps under a certain age and are genetically predispositioned to have a higher risk of breast cancer. And so we would put those limiters around the financial assistance program. You see that all the time in pharmaceutical PSPs as well. And so often if you look at kind of the allergy space, what you would see in a patient support program is a requirement to have a certain score. That score for kind of the severity of allergies is determined by the physician and is actually stored in the physician's electronic medical record. So one of the purposes of the PSP is to have kind of field nurses who actually travel to the physician's offices, have a look at the physician's electronic medical records, pull the relevant information, the patient scores from the electronic medical record, and it's those scores that often determine eligibility for financial assistance programs. That's kind of what the reimbursement landscape looks like within a patient support program. But again, I think it's really important to recognize that the purpose of the PSP from a reimbursement perspective is really to bridge that gap, right? And I think my segue over to Stefan will be, because we're bridging that gap, not only are we collecting the data from the CRO and the PSP that kind of informs your market access activities, but the PSP in that time frame where there is no coverage available for the product, the PSP is also submitting what's called a reimbursement appeal to the patient's insurers, both public and private. And so in that time frame, when you're likely working with your market access team to secure coverage, the payers are also receiving a reimbursement appeal for every single patient who's been prescribed or requisitioned your product. So it also generates, again, that awareness piece for your product with the payer community. So we kind of, if you have the right partnerships in place, your CRO, your PSP, and your market access team actually work together to help you remove those barriers. But it's not kind of one team that you're relying on. There's kind of those interconnectivities happening in the background. So the question is, who kind of covers the cost of the PSP services? And yes, there are different tactics we can take to negotiate that, but I would say it also depends on what PSP service we're talking about. So when we're talking about financial assistance, and so again, I'm going to go back to those three kind of pillars: financial assistance, medication administration, and then distribution. When we're talking about financial assistance, the service that the PSP is offering, if it's through a healthcare spending account, then it's just the healthcare spending account, and so there's no impact to the manufacturer. If we're talking about a financial assistance program in the form of free goods or compassionate or copay, that would be the manufacturer. And the differentiator there, or the important piece there, is if we're covering the cost of the product itself, then it will come at a cost to the manufacturer. If we're covering the cost of an ancillary service, such as distribution, would still be the manufacturer, but the service around it, so the medication administration or the nursing services, it's there where we can go to other stakeholders within the healthcare system and seek coverage on your behalf that doesn't implicate the manufacturer. So it's a way for you to kind of offset your cost, enable access to the product, without necessarily bearing a cost on the manufacturer itself. But anytime we're talking about covering the cost of the actual product, that would be a financial assistance through the manufacturer. But the services we can offset through other healthcare stakeholders. Do you want to answer that one if it's a CRO?
It's basically just fee for service. We bill the pharma company for our time and materials, and there typically isn't any kind of financial benefit to us if it's a successful product or if we facilitate market access. It's just we get paid to set it up, and then they get the benefit from it. We get our fees.
Question was already raised by you, Jeff, I think a couple of minutes ago. I mean, when should you start thinking about market access? And I think it's probably really the kind of question, the thinking process, right? The mindset, when that should be taken into consideration. We'll cover that by, let's say, introducing a bit as well why investors in a broader sense are obviously interested, because you also brought in, it's not only, let's say, the kind of typical, let's say, financial investors, but it could also be the next step into a cooperation with a pharmaceutical company, for example, which is also kind of investor at the end of the day, right? When you think about the life cycle of a product. And the other point is obviously, and you'll see that as well in a couple of minutes, hopefully, that, let's say, the earlier you start, let's say, the better you might be prepared at the end of the day when you reach the market, or when you want to, let's say, sell the licenses, for example, to a pharmaceutical company, because at the end of the day as well, you would need to think you have roughly 10 years time to, let's say, sell, meaning that you get your revenues versus your costs. And I mean, Caitlin, you have as well just mentioned, I mean, sometimes you could also take years until you have basically coverage and reimbursement. And that's, I think the 5 to 10 years was really a long time, but I heard that as well for Canada. I think the average time in most of the countries are probably more around, let's say, 2 years or 3 years, depending a bit on the product. Obviously, not every product is the same for sure. So just one slide further, please. Just very briefly, I think it's also the question, what should be taken into consideration, right? Which kind of information are available? And most of the information are also publicly available, right? It's also the question where to look for and what you're really looking for. So one of the suggestions basically is our Market Access podcast. So next slide, please, so we can jump into the content. So at the end of the day, when you follow again the life cycle, what Jeff has shown a couple of minutes ago, I mean, you have the early stages where you have the development, which is, I think, a key component, because ultimately, let's say, when you just follow that curve, or just remind that curve where you have basically just the costs, when it then goes up, basically, then you have the revenue, so you have a surplus in terms of income in a way. You only come, let's say, to that surplus if you have taken already the payer, and the payer mindset is already very early into considerations. Very important and very simple. to basically keep in mind, why are the payers important? You should really have that early on, is revenue has basically two parts of an equation, right? One is volume, so number of sales, number of packs, number of diagnostics used or similar, and the other one is price. And both can and are managed by payers. So if the payer is basically not paying anything, the price is ultimately, at least for the public payers, zero. Could be obviously as well bigger than zero, depend a bit on which kind of program you also use. But then it's also, again, the question of the volumes, right? If you have a patient access program, for example, this could help bridging, I think, the kind of gap until you have, at least in most of the, let's say, international markets, reimbursement in the public payer systems. So ultimately, payer decisions drive as well, let's say, the share prices, but also, let's say, the kind of discussions with investors, right? How do payers then basically assess the product? Because that's ultimately important, and that's at least something you should have in mind when you, let's say, plan your evidence and when you plan your clinical trial program. And that's, let's say, independent whether it's a medical device, a diagnostic, or pharmaceutical, or even a digital health product. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what payers, let's say, apply is the so-called health technology assessment. It is a systematic way how to assess and evaluate a product, again, in the widest sense. And what is normally being done is that there are, let's say, the assessors, and then in the second step, you basically have the kind of policy makers, right? Even within the payers, and sometimes even more on a political basis. So the question is, again, more what is included in such an HTA in short form, what is included in such a health technology assessment. Next one, please. Okay, thank you. So ultimately, I mean, you have two components of that, right? One is the clinical component, where also Jeff has spoken about already. The other one is the economic component. But what does that finally mean, right? I mean, when we speak with some clients, especially in the very early phase, and we just simply ask the first question in the early phase, maybe sometimes even before, let's say, we come to an agreement to work together. So do you have any kind of evidence? Of course we have, right? What a question. When we then sometimes just ask, send it over, please, so we can have a quick look. Because for us, it's obviously important to see how much of an effort it is to really get reimbursement in the various markets, right? And then we get here an abstract, and they're kind of single arm study, maybe with n equals 6, and maybe 2 patients further, etc., which is obviously very difficult when you think about a systematic way how payers assess it, right? It's very simple statistics, right? If I would ask you what you had when you were at university in statistics, for example, and I get maybe, I don't know, grade A somewhere, I would just say, great. In Canada, they are basically all statisticians, but it's not true, right? It was just n equals 1. That is the kind of payers thinking as well, when they just say, you know, we want to have a quite broad sample size, and finally also, we need to have it compared against what we are currently using. That's the other important consideration, right? It's not only the sample size, obviously, it's also even more important against what you would, let's say, compare to. So what do you take in there, right? Jeff also mentioned already earlier that you have the regulatory pathway, which is important because if you don't have regulatory approval, you cannot even approach payers, right? They would not just even open the door, for example, right? Which is, you know, do the first step first, then we can speak. So what happens a lot of times is that companies obviously are in contact with those regulators in Canada, in the US, also in Europe. And sometimes those regulators just simply say, you know what, I just need to know if the product is working and is not more risky, let's say, to whatever else is being applied for. But that whatever else is a lot of times just simply placebo. And again, this is very broadly speaking, right? Not only for pharmaceuticals, but placebo is, let's say, a bit of a tricky component, I would say. I mean, if you go to a doctor, I mean, how often have you gotten a prescription where there was just placebo on it? Never ever, obviously. You know, you could maybe interpret, look, I mean, if the doctor just says, you know, go home, and if it's not getting better, and then come back in a week, that's maybe a bit of placebo, right? But let's say for a payer, it's quite clear that there's always somewhere a kind of comparator, even if it's another mode of action, even if it's another kind of drug class or whatever. It's just a question, what is currently being used by the physicians, or what is currently being, let's say, applied for, right? It's the same in the diagnostic area, it's the same with the device area. So this is also, let's say, included in that kind of clinical package. And furthermore, I think that's the second and most important thing, right? First one is a comparator. The second one is how do you measure the clinical effectiveness or the benefit of your product, right? Sometimes in the pharmaceutical world, you have those kind of, let's say, endpoints like response rate, right? I mean, for example, the tumor is no more, let's say, or is shrinking maybe even, right? That's something what is being applied for sometimes, and that might even work, right? In the diagnostic areas, it's sensitivity, specificity. We all know that since COVID. But a lot of times, payers have their kind of clear direction what they want to have. And I think what payers globally, let's say, want to see is something what is important for the patient. So it's the patient relevance. So how relevant is, for example, my favorite example is always coming out of diabetes, the HbA1c level. It's just the blood glucose level over, I think it's 3 months as far as I remember. For clinicians, for diabetes patients, it's very relevant. And it's also a lot of times used in clinical trials because you can easily assess it, right? For every patient, you just get him or her into the clinical trial, you measure it, and after a given time, whatever that is, you have the results. But when you approach a payer, they would just ask, okay, HbA1c, is that something what a patient can feel? Not really. Because ultimately, it's more a question of HbA1c might have an impact on the long-term kind of complications or other adverse events, for example, right? So for a payer, it's not the HbA1c, it's more seen as a kind of surrogate towards what is coming at the end, which is a myocardial infarction or a stroke or anything like that. The issue is obviously, and that's a bit then again the tricky part for the pharmaceutical companies, that's where we could also work again with real-world let's say, with real-world data at the end of the day to bridge maybe again the gap, more the kind of evidence gap from HbA1c, for example, towards a heart clinic endpoint is just imagine how long such a trial would need to be run, right? And how much money you would probably need. I mean, Jeff has just thrown in a couple of millions of euros, dollars, or whatever that was, right? I mean, just imagine, I mean, such a trial. It's just really difficult. Anyway, it's a request of the payers because what they basically tell you, it's not our problem, it's your problem, right? You have the risk, you will have the money, you need to do what we should, or what we are basically asking for. So that's the first component of it. And also to tell you, payers are not asking as a first question what you want to charge for that kind of new product or what the price is. The first question is always, what could the product basically do for the patient? It's always that first question. It's also very simple and easy, right? For a payer, it's easier to say, we will not pay for that product because it has not proven the effectiveness, instead of saying it's too expensive. So even, let's say, I think most of the times Cadet or NICE in the UK or a couple of other payers are using that kind of clinical argumentation. I would say also a bit of an excuse sometimes, right? Yes, prices are too high for them, but it's, again, easier to say, just show me really what the product could do. But the second component of that systematic analysis is the economics. And the economics, again, is quite variable depending, again, on the jurisdiction we're speaking about. I mean, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, and a couple of other countries, you basically have, again, a systematic way how to assess the so-called cost effectiveness, right? So you put both, let's say, terminology or both kind of data together, you analyze it, and then you get a number out there with a range normally or with a confidence interval. And then it's more the question, is that number what is coming out there, for example, $50,000 for one additional life year, is that high or not? They're given different kind of thresholds available in the different markets. Sometimes it's also a bit more flexible. And in other jurisdictions, the economics is more, let's say, taken from a negotiation perspective, right? So you're having the benefit assessment, for example, in France, in Germany, I would also say partly in the US, for example, and then you're ending up in a negotiation between the company and then obviously the payer, whatever the payer is, right, a private or a public payer. And then it's more the kind of discussion, is the product worth the request of the price? And then you're obviously doing the kind of negotiation bit, right? So that is, again, that economic bit could be different, but the clinical part is mainly the same in a way. We have also done an analysis a couple of years ago in rheumatoid arthritis. The same evidence base with the same clinical trials for different kind of products. We just wanted to see if payers are assessing the same way, and especially more importantly, if they have the same outcome. So ultimately, if the product has proven its benefit, it should also be reimbursed, right? But what we have seen is basically a mix of different results. Some have rejected it, some have easily accepted it, some have just said, we just limit the reimbursement for 2 years, we need more data. Some have just said, we need to get into experimental coverage or something similar. So it is not exactly that easy to say the payers are everywhere the same. I think that's also what Caitlin said already earlier. The next slide is just on, let's say, which kind of evidence payers want to see, and I can just start speaking about it, right? What I said earlier already is the question is basically always against what you want to compare and need to compare to, right? So it's basically the kind of comparative effectiveness in a broader sense. So when you start here more from, let's say, the top 3 of that kind of pyramid, which is the clinical evidence pyramid, every payer is taken into consideration, is that they normally want to have a randomized controlled trial, which is sometimes difficult as well for some of the devices, for example. How could you randomize if you, for example, have something new on a surgery versus maybe a situation that currently no surgery is being done for, right? So it's very, let's say, difficult in a way to get also patient recruited for such a kind of randomization. Not even speaking about, let's say, blinding a study. But independent, just keep in mind, payers want to see that. Sometimes, let's say, I call it just a bit of the lower evidence, right, is also acceptable. I said already earlier on, it's the same with the endpoints, for example. Sometimes a sensitivity and specificity is enough to prove or to be proven, and then let's say that payers would also accept the product for reimbursement and funding. But this is the way you should just keep thinking, right? What I just want to let's say emphasize here is also, even if maybe an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, is not possible, have it in mind that payers might request it. And you would just at least need to have the answer why you have maybe not run an RCT. That's why we always say, take the payer's mindset into consideration, not always simply following them, right? Sometimes also, I would just say it's negotiation tactics a lot of times, even in the early days, right? That they say, it's another very expensive whatever, let's postpone it, because as Jeff said, they obviously know that maybe patent exclusivity is maybe for 20 years, you already spent 10 years. If I, let's say, take another 5 years away, I just need to pay 5 years the high price, because after that maybe generics or, let's say, comparator products are as well being launched for. In the pharmaceutical world, in the medical device world, it's even more, let's say, dynamic, right? Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So, yeah, ultimately, very quickly, cost and outcomes needs to be obviously a bit in a balance. But again, here, it's also the question how, let's say, which method is also being applied for by the payers, right? Systematically, or whether it's more a negotiation. Yeah, next slide. So global context of HAs, it's a bit what I have already said earlier. All of the different payers might be different. Sometimes it's even, let's say, different even within a country, right? You have sometimes a national payer, and then you have the second layer as a regional payer, and then you're even going down on a local payer. And with each of those, you might need to discuss, again, firstly, about the clinical benefit, and then secondly, again, on the economic benefit. So that's just something keep it in mind, because, and especially when you take, for example, into considerations, let's say they're quite dense, and that's, I think, the middle picture on the top, Europe, but also, for example, Canada, where, let's say, all of those, let's say those kind of 2 continents and the various countries there are, let's say, as well referring to each other, especially, let's say, from a pricing perspective. And we have had a lot of, let's say, negotiations and discussions with payers in Europe, or also in Canada, where they have just said, but NICE in UK has just decided XYZ. It was obviously then more negative, right? Or Germany has, let's say, decided that the price was too high. And then obviously you need to react as well, meaning that you would also need to think about, let's say, which countries you would, for example, firstly approach when you want to go international, right? So if you, for example, develop something in Canada, it's also the question what we have a lot of times, should it be Canada first, or should you maybe, for example, as well first go into the US? And then the question is also which kind of other countries might then follow, which could be countries in Europe. Think about maybe a digital health product. So, for example, a digital health app, where we have quite interesting kind of systems now in France and Belgium and also in Germany, where you could also get even reimbursement while you have just, let's say, a proof of concept, right? So the first idea needs to be proven, and then you would get basically an experimental coverage by those systems, which is in a way also available in some of the, let's say, the, payer, I would say, types in the US, for example. Okay, next slide. Yes, that's what I mentioned. I think I will not go through all of those lines, right? But the message, I think, is very clear. If you, let's say, do the wrong, let's say, first step, because you have not thought about the second, third, and fourth step, then you might even lose, even if you have the right data, but just because of the price referencing. So sometimes we had also clients where they were just thinking, you know what, I can speak English, so I will first do England and approach them to get funding and reimbursement. My first reaction normally, and then I'm very happy that I just do team calls in the first, let's say, meetings. I could just switch off the camera, right? I was like, oh, another one. You know, it's okay, right? I can understand that, right? I mean, it's easier from an administrative perspective, and maybe that's okay, right? It's just, let's say, from a price optimization perspective, it's, let's say, not the smartest way to go. But again, it's just something, keeping in mind how you want to move forward. Within Europe, but also obviously, let's say, if you take the US, Canada, and for example, also Japan into considerations. Next slide, please. So I think also very broadly, and I think I mentioned it, let's say, partly in a way, payers are very different, obviously, but ultimately you can just say you have, let's say, 4 different ways how payers look at, let's say, the assessments in general, right? You have a couple of health economic countries, and I think that's already a picture, yeah, it's already quite old. So I think the red countries are maybe as well been taken over in Europe. But you see a couple of those more, let's say, health economics driven countries where they are more taking the systematic cost effectiveness analysis into considerations. It is what I mentioned before, Australia, Canada, the UK, but nowadays also the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, Portugal, for example, in Europe. But I think also South Africa has moved in that direction. I think also Taiwan in Asia, for example. I think the US we would not need to cover. I think that's a very specific kind of market. So I think we just named it competitive insurance, and I've just, I have just taken that from Ed Schoenfeld as a good kind of source. And then we have as well, obviously, emerging cash, which is also an opportunity, right? It's for every company and product could be a good opportunity, not only in these countries, but also in some of those other countries. But you need again to keep in mind, if you, let's say, price it too low also there, this might also have an impact on your assessment on that kind of, let's say, economic and benefit kind of balance, right? We have just seen also in various jurisdictions across Europe that some of the payers have just said, but you know, you're just selling the product in Brazil for 12 euros. And you want to have us paying 250 euros. So why the hell? Yes, of course, there might be differences, right? But it's very difficult to come from a very low price to, let's say, a more reasonable price. So that's why we just say, just keep thinking how you do it. It could also be, and that's maybe the better approach, either just give it for free, so you maybe use as well the opportunity to get more data, or at least have a high list price and give some kind of discounts, which is always a bit better, for example, instead of just going in too low. Next slide, please. Very quickly only, optimization of the package, because a lot of times, and we're aware of that, obviously, the package, meaning the clinical data, are not optimal. It could be, and I have also been sitting at those, let's say, tables and those discussions, that maybe the budget is simply not enough, right? Maybe the endpoint is clear what the payer want to have, but you don't have the budget for that. So you would maybe need to go with the second best option. Or just imagine your first tier country, your first launch country is the US, and for the US, maybe a placebo-controlled trial is fine. But you know that in Europe you might get then issues. There are a lot of good examples on that. But it's maybe still the good way to go, because you could first get some revenues in before you would then potentially expand further. It's still the question how then basically to optimize those kind of data packages. And I think one of the examples I think Caitlin has as well already spoken about is basically generating further real life data, which could then as well be taken into the kind of package. I think the best example for that are the, let's say, latest kind of submitted, at least in Europe, are reimbursed CAR T cell therapies. Payers have just decided on a promise, not on clinical evidence. The sample size in those trials were, I don't know, less than 20. Some, I think, had 9 patients in there. Yes, of course, they work. We know it now, but we only know it because of real-life data. So that's, again, coming back. If you have an innovation, it's more important, and I think it's also probably somewhere on that slide, to get into an early engagement, into an early discussion with payers. They're open for that, even in the very early stages, because for them it's also easier if you can follow what they want to have, right? Because they would rather discuss if the price is right or if the price may be too high, whether already, let's say, discussing earlier and to say, you know what, we think that the product is probably valuable, but we cannot see it in your data, which also happens sometimes. So that's, I think, the message here, and again, we'll not go through all of those different things, is more, even if you don't have an optimized package for the payers, there are ways, statistical ways, political ways sometimes, and other ways to potentially still get into the market. It's just more important, again, here, think about it and plan for that early enough, because otherwise you might end up in that kind of 10 years that you might be just left with 2 years of time that where you maybe have an optimized revenue for your company. Next slide, please. Oh yes, very briefly, because I also have a kind of marketing pack in there. What we have done, obviously, in the last years is exactly what we have now developed for and with an artificial intelligence. It's basically a very kind of early assessment tool where and what you should be thinking about. It has basically 3 simple components. The first one is what I said already now, is an early clinical assessment. So how would payers likely look at your kind of product? The second one is how does current coding and epidemiology look like, which is obviously important because sometimes there's already code available. So maybe you could even utilize that, which might as well, let's say, foster your time to market access and to the market itself. And finally, it's also which kind of reimbursement pathway to take. I mean, if I would have taken, let's say, just for 3 or 4 countries reimbursement pathways, we would be sitting here probably for 2 days. So that is why we have not brought in, right? But in that tool, you have, let's say, a couple of easy, let's say, clicks where you can get exactly to the right kind of pathway. Very quickly to the next one. So yeah, I don't know whether you can really see it, but let's say the first component is a tool which has also been used by payers in the past. Very simple, very top level, which kind of evidence you have, which kind of trials you have. Is it a surrogate endpoint? Is it a hard endpoint? And then you can just enter as well your kind of efficacy, even in the early phases, right? So if you have a target product profile from your scientists, for example, you could also enter that you get a kind of score on the efficacy profile. On the next slide, you see it very similar. Next one, please. On the safety bit, and on the next one, please. You see basically how it looks like, and we've changed the colors there, but how it looks like as a kind of first snapshot, right? You will get a score between, let's say, I think it's -10 and +10. So everything in the minus direction is basically the way that payers would probably say, that's probably not enough. There's somewhere an issue. And everything in the positive side is more where payers might just say, in general, the evidence package would probably be something acceptable. Obviously, the higher the number, the better, but it would give you already a kind of indication. Next one, please. Yes, then we have as well the kind of question, which kind of codes are already available. So codes are obviously quite difficult, because I mean, if you want to find a code in France, you need to be able to speak French. Maybe in Canada it's not the biggest kind of issue, but then we can maybe move to Germany, and then it's getting an issue. And if you then follow, let's say, Italy and a couple of other countries, you really have a problem. Or take the US. I mean, if we sometimes need to find US codes, that's sometimes a nightmare. So it's also, or let's say that's the way how we, let's say, is well coded in the way that you could enter, let's say, your kind of search words, right? Breast cancer or whatever else, HIV, and then you could find the kind of codes which are available, that you have already a first idea how that looks like. And we have also included in some countries already the clinical guidelines for research on the epidemiology, so very first kind of touch on the number of patients, and that could also be complemented by ChatGPT, which is also looking for number of patients. And then the final bit, and I think you can just, yeah, that's I think it already. I think that's The final bit is more on the reimbursement pathway. So what we have included, at least for Germany, we have it very simply already included. We'll also adapt that for the other countries, is that you have a couple of simple questions that you can go through, right? Is your product, I don't know, pharmaceutical? If it's no, then you get the question, is it maybe a product in the digital health area? Is it more for inpatient, outpatient? And then at the end, you're getting to the kind of right pathway that you could just say, okay, that's likely the pathway I would need to take. And then you get the kind of requirements and the pathway you would basically need to think of for the different countries. So you have basically a package also early on how to utilize. It will be launched in October. We have already some countries available, and by October we'll have EU5 and US, Canada already available. So it just, if that's something for, let's say, to be planned for, just let us know as well. And then I think we're basically very close to the end. Yes. So I would just thank you all for the questions as well. And yeah, that's probably the question. If you have any kind of questions, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Speed. We're looking for experience. So it depends on the therapeutic area, but we'll go out to our network so if it's a cardiovascular trial, we'll preferentially choose sites that we've worked with before, that we know that they can recruit in a timely manner. We often have to work with relatively naive sites, so we have a team that goes in and trains them, and we spend more attention with them to get them up to speed, because it is an opportunity for these clinical investigators to augment their income and also to get published. So there's some other advantages for them to participate, and so we do work with some naive. But the short question is experienced investigators that have enrolled all the number of patients they were supposed to as fast as they were supposed to. And that's often a problem in Canada, to be quite frank. We often have to go outside of Canada to get that kind of attention.
Canada and the US, and if that helps, let's say, to enter Europe, right? The question firstly is obviously if there's a code available in Europe as well. And the second question is anyway, what kind of price you want to charge for, right? If your, let's say, price expectation is very similar to the code you see, if there's a code available, that is speeding up obviously the process. But a lot of times, let's say, available codes are, let's say, not sufficient, right? I mean, if it's covering, let's say, 80 euros or 40 euros for maybe a diagnostic, what we have sometimes in some of the countries, but you say, look, we have an innovation, we need to spend quite a lot of money for clinical trials, you would maybe want to have as well a higher amount, right? Then, let's say the available codes might not really speed it up, but what might help is obviously if you have already experience in other countries. At least in the way that you could, for example, again, going back to Caitlin's point, if you have also some kind of real life data available, that might obviously help. And also in Europe, they will consider Canada and US data in there, at least in terms of safety and some effectiveness, efficacy. You might see differences, for example, if you would have a story on hospitalizations, because that is heavily dependent also on the healthcare system, right? So that's maybe something keeping in mind. Yeah, I mean, otherwise, again, it depends a bit which kind of direction you also need to follow and go through, but important maybe as well to mention, that is I think what I have not mentioned in this on the slides there, is obviously KOL involvement, right? So you need to have good relationship with clinicians in the various countries. So for example, also here, it might help that you have some kind of relationships already in Canada and in the US, because they could obviously as well be able to transfer their knowledge and that kind of hopefully enthusiasm as well to some of the clinicians as well in Europe. And then it goes back again that they need as well some kind of own experience, because payers also want to know if there are some local, meaning country kind of clinicians already using it and what their experience was.
One part I didn't remember to bring up, I don't think. I think there are a couple of people in the audience that are interested in medical device development. The timeline to develop a medical device depends. We've got class 1, 2, and 3, class 1 being a Band-Aid, class 3 being a pacemaker, so much more invasive. But generally about 5 to 7 years, and 40 to 70 million to develop to commercialization. So significantly less, 5% of the cost, half the timeline. if you're risk adverse, that's probably the way to go in terms of developing a healthcare product. But yeah, I also don't think as much of a upside.